She walked through the house, bruised and battered, looking for the restroom, her attacker menacingly trailing behind her. As she goes to the bathroom and looks from her peripheral view, she saw a decapitated body sitting in the next room. In Cleveland, Ohio, there was a company called Ray's Sausage. Ray's Sausage started in 1957 and sold sausage and sausage-related accessories. Ray's Sausage was located on Imperial Street for many years, but recently, there's just this incredible stench that they can't get rid of. The stench was so bad that the neighbors complained about it. Eventually, inspectors would come by and look at the location and talk to the workers, who confirmed that it was like living in a stinky nightmare. Every day smelled so bad that Ray's Sausage would end up spending over $20,000 getting a new ventilation system and new equipment because they thought it was really bad sewer gas. But even with all the upgrades, it still didn't work. The community continued complaining about Ray's Sausage, and they were in danger of losing their business. As this is going on, right next to them lived a man named Anthony. Anthony was born in 1949, and like his neighbors around him, he too was disgusted by the stench from the sausage factory. The crazy thing about it, he was the true reason for the stench that people thought belonged to the sausage company. After Anthony turned 19, he went to serve in the Marines. To get out of the crime-ridden area of East Cleveland, going to the armed forces was a great way to obtain a better life. It was noted that he left with a few accolades under his belt, but the Marines pretty much kept his service and what he did close to the chest, aside from his rank, his name, and his Marine number. However, while in the Marines, Anthony developed a nasty drinking habit. So much so that the woman that he married while he was in the Marines ended up divorcing him as soon as he was discharged. Womp womp. When Anthony came back to East Cleveland, it had completely changed. It was majority black. It was well below the poverty line. The crack epidemic hit East Cleveland so hard, and there were many women who were in the business of selling their body just for a hit of that good stuff. Anthony, who had been released into the environment, found it very hard to cope with a lot of the issues that he was experiencing. He was dealing with trauma from his childhood, trauma from being in the Marines, and also dodging child support from a 7-year-old child that he wanted nothing to do with. He would often drink excessively daily, and once he became drunk, he became very violent as well. While living on Page Avenue, his first run-in with the law was about abusing a woman and being sentenced to jail for several days. However, Anthony did not learn his lesson and was arrested again for the rape of a 21-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant. The woman met Anthony at a motel, and later Anthony would persuade her to come back to his place. Once there, he grabbed her and threw her on the bed and proceeded to rape her for hours. When she would try to escape, he bound her hands and feet so that she could not move. Once Anthony fell asleep, she was able to get loose, and she ran. She told the police her story, and they did search for Anthony, but unfortunately, he was nowhere to be found. During this time, Anthony would link up with another woman at a place on East 71st. At first, they were having a good time. They were drinking and laughing, and suddenly Anthony stood up and started choking the woman from behind. This guy might have a problem, y'all. He yelled obscene things to her and drug her upstairs, where he proceeded to rape her orally, vaginally, and anally. Even after she told him she was 5 months pregnant, he did not care. Anthony would then fall asleep, and just like previously, the woman escaped and would later come back with the police while he was still sleeping. You fucked up, Anthony. After his arrest, Anthony would go to trial, but the second victim would not come in to testify. The police were unable to locate her. However, they still had the victim from the previous assault, and Anthony was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Get this guy off the street expeditiously, everyone yelled. Well, I would have yelled that had I been there. Anthony was a model prisoner. He relied on his electrician skills from when he was in the Marines. He honed his cooking talents, and he didn't have any major issues, just a few minor fractions here and there. He became sober, and his mental exams showed that he was no longer a threat to society and would be unlikely he would rape again. He served his full sentence and was released in 2005. He would move to Imperial Avenue next to Ray's Sausage and work on getting himself together. He rented a room in his stepmother's home. He would join programs that helped convicts find a job and adapt to life on the outside. Anthony would eventually date several women who lived in his area, including the niece of the mayor of Cleveland, Lori. Anthony was on the upswing. Perhaps prison did rehabilitate Anthony. Unfortunately, around 2007, Anthony's life took a nosedive. The relationship between him and Lori came to an end after being together for over 2 years. He later didn't show up to work and was ultimately fired. During this time, he would not only drink alcohol, but would increase his use of crack. This doesn't sound like it's going to be good. Not one to let life keep him down, Anthony would have gatherings and invite people over for cookouts, drinking, and cracking with his friends. I'm assuming that's what you call it. Using crack as an action verb, people get hip to it. It was around this time that the incredibly disturbing stench started to wafer in the neighborhood. It was also around this time that women, specifically black women, would go missing in the Cleveland area. Yet, there were no cause for alarm because all these women were prostitutes and drug addicts. Who cares? Shame on you, Cleveland. In September 2008, Anthony met up with Vanessa and they were going to do drugs together. In the beginning, things were going great. They were having a fun time when, out of the blue, Anthony would punch the mess out of Vanessa's face and demand that she take her clothes off. He would go on to rape her for hours. In between one of the rapes, Vanessa would go to the restroom, and as she went to the restroom, she would look over her peripheral view and see a headless body sitting in the chair in the other room. Whoa! What a house decoration.
I'm sorry, I know you're into the story, but real quick, if you like these stories, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that every time I release something, you know when I'm releasing it. Okay, thank you, bye.
She said she had to pretend not to see it so that she wouldn't scream and alarm him, because if she alarmed him, he would probably kill her. But kudos, Vanessa, because if I see a dead body, it's Scream City, baby. He would eventually let her go because she promised she would not tell. When Vanessa was released the next day, it was during the morning time, and the church across the street had let out. Many of the church people saw her, bruised and bloody, but no one offered her any help. Everyone ignored her. When she needed people the most, they ignored her. Vanessa would call the police and tell them what happened, but they wanted her to come down to the police station to file a report, which she didn't feel was safe to do, so no one followed up with Anthony. In December 2008, Gladys was walking on the street, minding her business, not even looking to do any crack, when she encountered Anthony. Anthony offered her to party and invited her back to his house, but she politely declined because Gladys had places to go. At that point, no wasn't an option, so he grabbed her and dragged her into his house, choking her to the point of losing consciousness. When Gladys awoke, he punched her in her face and ordered her to remove her clothing. But Gladys was not going. She fought back, clawing at his face, and eventually got away from Anthony. Gladys would then run to a restaurant, but they would not help her. So she kept running and ran into a police officer who really didn't take her seriously. But he took the report, because he had nothing else to do. Unfortunately, her case would be incorrectly labeled, and Anthony was released from jail with minor charges. This guy is just getting away with murder, literally. In 2009, Tanya went to see her good friend Anthony. Now, Tanya and Anthony had been friends for several years and often hung out together, drinking and getting high. In this particular instance, after finishing watching the basketball game, Anthony would suddenly choke Tanya and force her to get naked, or she could be, I quote, dead like another crack bitch up the streets. This guy is a poet. Scared out of her wits, she complied, and he raped her. She would lay there, and once Anthony woke up, he seemed not to reference to anything that happened previously. It was almost like he had no idea what took place. Tanya would make up some type of excuse, and she would eventually leave. Needless to say, they weren't friends any longer. In September 2009, Anthony was up to his old tricks again. Him and Latundra would drink and smoke crack, to which he took her upstairs to the third floor where his room was located. He punched her in her face and forced her to get naked. He would beat her and choke her with an electrical cord. Latundra eventually escaped and would go to the police, but the case would sit on their desk for at least a month before anyone would do anything about it. I hope you guys are seeing a pattern here, like just a crazy pattern. In October 2009, Sean met with Anthony at his house to, you guessed it, drink and smoke crack. And like many times before, he would assault Sean and force her to get naked. But this time went a little different. During the rape, he would go and close the window so that people couldn't hear her yelling. But while he was doing that, she would escape through one of the open windows. He would try to drag her back in, but then he ultimately pushed her really hard to the ground, proudly hoping the fall would kill her. But luckily for her, it was just a 2-story fall. Anthony would then come out the house naked to try and pull the naked woman back in. But by this time, bystanders had realized this is not normal. The owner of the local bar came over to see what was happening, and Anthony told him that they were having sex and his woman fell out the window. The bar owner was like, yeah, okay, and then proceeded to call the police. Anthony almost got the woman to his front door, but then the emergency services showed up. They took Sean to the hospital where she remained unconscious for 3 days. Anthony told the emergency team that he was her boyfriend and he had tried to stay with her at the hospital as long as he could, but he got spooked and eventually left. However, he would keep that mental chokehold on Sean and call up to the hospital when she came to and threaten to kill her if she said anything. Now, while this was happening, one of the previous police reports finally came to the top of someone's desk, and the detectives requested a search warrant for Anthony's home. At this time, the police would go to Anthony's home, and that stench, which was overwhelming, well, these police officers had an idea what that stench could be. At this time, Anthony was not home, so they let themselves in. Rude! On the first review, they found 2 corpses laying on the floor of the home. These belonged to Diane Turner and Talacia Fortson. The next day, the police came back with a cadaver dog. They located 3 additional bodies, one in the basement, one in the crawl space, and one in a body bag on the 3rd floor. These bodies belonged to Janice Webb, Nancy Cobb, and Tashana Culver. The same day in the backyard, they found another buried body, and it belonged to Tanya Carmichael. The police said to themselves, fellas, we got a real sickle on our hands. I don't have any proof that they said this, but I'm guessing that they did. The police left and came back again to do additional searching because I know they're like, what the fludge? But because the dog found one body in the backyard, there was probably more. They needed a larger piece of equipment to do the digging, and they came back with something called a backhoe, which you use for construction sites. Upon their additional search, they discovered 4 more corpses belonging to Michelle Mason, Kim Smith, Imelda Hunter, and Crystal Dozier.
I'm sorry, I know you're into the story, but real quick, if you like these stories, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that every time I release something, you know when I'm releasing it. Okay, thank you, bye.
There was also a skull found in a red bucket in the basement. This belonged to LaShanda Long. None of the parts of her body would ever be retrieved. The autopsy reports would go on to show that these women had been choked and strangled. Some of them still had the ligature marks from where they were tied by Anthony. These acts would be confirmed by the reports from the women who escaped alive. Anthony had tried to escape, but by this time his identity was plastered all over the news. He was recognized by a bystander and the police would quickly arrest him. Anthony would go to trial. His victims would come and share their horrifying and graphic details of the brutal violence that they suffered at his hands. His niece would also testify in court that Anthony had an abusive and traumatic childhood thanks to his mother, who not only raised him, but also his sister's children, aka her grandchildren. Perhaps Anthony's sexual deviance started in his youth. I say that because he, along with other males in the household, would take part in raping his niece when she was at the age of 10 years old. What the The victims would describe Anthony as a nice guy. He was respectful and he was kind. But when he would consume these drugs and alcohol, it would turn him into a demon. Anthony would say that he had voices in his head, and they would talk to him and tell him to commit these acts of violence. Afterwards, he would black out and then would wake up the next day unaware of what happened previously. At the end of the trial, there was no doubt in anyone's mind Anthony did that shit. Anthony would be sentenced to death, but would ultimately die in prison at the age of 61 due to illness. Since Anthony's imprisonment, many of the families in Cleveland who had a missing black female relative have reached out to the police to see if any of those women found were one of their loved ones. DNA testing were able to identify the identities of the deceased women. Police did not believe that this was Anthony's only murders. They opened some previously unsolved cases from the 1980s to see if they could potentially be victims of Anthony. Some of those cases, specifically 3 of the bodies that were found near his home on Page Avenue, fit his MO, aka choking and rape. They also noticed that these murders have stopped around the time that Anthony was arrested. Currently, those cases are still being investigated. Since then, the home that Anthony lived in had been destroyed, and there has been a monument erected for the 11 women who lost their lives. The smell is no longer there, and Ray's sausage, whose video recording of the woman jumping out the window was used during the trial, has rebounded and are better than ever. Vindication! Anthony could have been caught at any time had the police taken his victims who escaped seriously. Instead, they looked down these poor women because they were black and they were drug addicts and sex workers. And Anthony knew this, and because of this, he was able to move in silence without fear of repercussions. The survivors are trying to put the pieces of their lives back together, but deal with a lot of psychological issues, naturally. Everyone deserves to be protected and to be safe, regardless of the choices of how they choose to live their lives. Had the police department taken these women more seriously, you wouldn't have had someone dubbed the Cleveland Strangler destroying so many lives for as long as he did.